The first reports surfaced quietly, almost timidly, in the fall of 1977, when the air over central Illinois carried that strange mixture of dry corn dust and cold river wind. People remembered the season not because of anything extraordinary in the harvest or in the local elections, but because something in the atmosphere felt slightly off, as if the towns scattered between Peoria and Springfield were holding their breath without knowing why. It began with whispers. Staff meetings ending earlier than usual, teachers looking over their shoulders as they crossed empty parking lots, and janitors reporting classroom doors left ajar when no one had been inside. The tension was subtle, but it was there, moving under the surface like a current people sensed long before they understood it. Most residents didn't pay much attention at first. The Midwest during the late 1970s was accustomed to long shadows and quiet roads, to highways where a single pair of headlights might appear only every few minutes. Illinois had its own rhythm then, slow, predictable, marked by PTA schedules and county fairs. So when the first teacher failed to show up for work one Monday morning, many assumed it was a misunderstanding, maybe a family emergency, or a missed alarm. But the tone changed when her car was found neatly parked near an abandoned picnic area south of Galesburg. The keys still inside, the driver's seat pushed slightly forward, as if she had stepped out for only a moment. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no frantic footprints. Just an eerie sense that the vehicle had been left in a hurry, though nothing inside appeared disturbed. Investigators treated the case as a missing person report, nothing more. They searched the nearby woods and riverbanks, spoke to the woman's colleagues, and mapped out her last known movements. Yet the absence of anything concrete unsettled them. A week passed, then 2. Eventually, the town folded the loss into its daily routine, the way small towns do. Quietly, almost reluctantly, telling themselves it must have been an isolated tragedy. People lit candles at church, left small notes at the faculty lounge, and avoided lingering too long on the fear that something larger might be unfolding. What no one knew then was that a man in a faded brown sedan, a mid-1970s Pontiac with a dent near the rear bumper, had been driving those same highways, circling parking lots after dusk, and watching staff members leave schools one by one. The car would later become a central piece of the pattern, mentioned in nearly every report, though at the time it looked like nothing more than another old vehicle blending into the Midwestern landscape. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost cautiously, as if guided by a ritual only the driver understood. By early 1978, the second disappearance struck, this time in a district nearly 70 miles away. The teacher, a married man in his mid-30s known for his calm voice and precise handwriting, vanished during his routine stop to grade papers at the school library. His truck was found parked beside the service entrance, the engine off, the driver's door locked. Inside, officers noted something unusual, a single sheet of lined notebook paper resting on the passenger seat. The page contained several neatly written sentences, lesson-style instructions, almost like a chalkboard outline. They were not threatening, not frantic, not even unfinished. Instead, the handwriting appeared deliberate, controlled, as if someone had been practicing structure rather than conveying meaning. The district superintendent tried to suppress speculation by calling it a coincidence, a misplaced document, a misinterpreted note. But word spread quickly, traveling first between teachers, then across staff rooms, then into the small diners where news always landed before the newspapers did. People started checking their rearview mirrors more often, scanning for the Pontiac described vaguely by a night shift custodian who thought he had seen it idling behind the cafeteria building the previous week. Parents began picking up their children earlier, and principals instructed staff to walk to their cars in pairs after sunset. Local police departments opened parallel investigations, but the communication between counties in that era was slow and often fragmented. Without digital databases or statewide systems linking patterns, officers relied on phone calls, typed reports, and memory, especially under stress, often failed them. Still, a few detectives noticed the timing, the professions of the victims, and the strange presence of written notes. They exchanged uneasy theories during late-night calls, wondering whether these incidents were truly isolated. Meanwhile, the brown Pontiac kept appearing near school properties, never close enough to draw immediate suspicion, never long enough for anyone to approach it. Teachers described glimpsing it at the far edges of parking lots as they left grade-level meetings or evening rehearsals. Some said they noticed a man inside, though his features blurred in the dim yellow of streetlights. Others insisted they heard the old engine idling softly, as if waiting for the right moment to move again. By the spring of 1979, the atmosphere across several Illinois districts had shifted from quiet unease to a restrained, private dread. Teachers began reporting small disturbances, classroom drawers left open, staff mailboxes shuffled, chalk lines drawn too straight or too precise on boards they were sure they'd erased. Principals dismissed most of these accounts as stress-related, but privately they admitted feeling something uncanny. It wasn't overt danger, it was the sensation of being observed, monitored, studied. And then the first letter arrived. It was delivered to a high school in Decatur, addressed not to an individual, but to the faculty. The envelope held a single sheet, carefully folded. The handwriting matched the one found earlier, firm, structured, almost academic. The content was strange, more like a lesson plan than a message. The writer had outlined topics such as discipline, repetition, correction, and silence. There were no threats, no signatures, no demands, only a closing line written with chilling clarity. The teacher becomes the lesson. When investigators examined the letter, they noted no fingerprints, no smudges, nothing extraneous. The paper itself was standard, the ink unremarkable, but the phrasing echoed something detectives had discussed privately. The possibility that the perpetrator had a fixation not just on educators, but on the act of teaching itself. The idea unsettled them. It suggested planning, structure, a curated ritual. Over the next month, sightings of the Pontiac increased, though the man inside remained elusive. Some teachers reported seeing the car parked near rural backroads, connecting different districts. Others noticed it in rest stop lots late at night. The vehicle became a symbol whispered among staff, a silent talisman of dread. Some districts even circulated informal sketches of the car, though no one could describe the driver well enough to produce a portrait. When the third disappearance occurred in late 1980, authorities could no longer treat the events as unrelated. This time the victim was a young history teacher, only 2 years into her career. She had stayed late to prepare materials for a unit on the Reconstruction era. The last colleague to see her alive remembered the sound of her heels clicking in the hallway, then fading toward the staff exit. Her car was later found near an overpass along a rural highway, the driver's seat pushed back slightly, as if someone else had been sitting there. On the dashboard lay a sheet of paper with another set of handwritten lines, lesson-like again, structured, almost clinical. By then, the pattern was undeniable. The victims were all educators. Their vehicles were left in quiet or isolated places, and every case included written material. Investigators began coordinating across counties, forming a multi-jurisdiction task group that met in borrowed conference rooms and municipal basements. They pinned maps to walls, marked highways with colored string, and catalogued sightings of the Pontiac. For the first time, the scattered incidents began forming a shape, imperfect, incomplete, but coherent enough to suggest deliberate design. Yet understanding the pattern didn't bring them closer to identifying the man behind it. He remained silent, observant, mobile, someone who understood school schedules, staff routines, and the professional habits of teachers. Someone who planned meticulously, who moved without haste, and who left behind just enough structure to be noticed, but not enough to be traced. And somewhere on those long, dim Midwestern roads, the Pontiac kept traveling, calmly, methodically, while the pattern deepened. By the early months of 1981, the investigations had entered an uncomfortable rhythm. Detectives drove back and forth along the same rural highways, revisiting the same school parking lots, tracing the same narrow riverside pull-offs where the abandoned vehicles had been found. They carried folders thick with interviews from faculty members who remembered small details that felt important at the time. Strangers attending open house nights, unfamiliar cars parked too far from the main entrance, papers disappearing from classroom desks. Yet when these accounts were placed side by side, the fragments never aligned cleanly enough to form a complete picture. Everything remained blurred, like chalk smudged across a blackboard. Across the counties affected, the atmosphere inside the teaching community shifted noticeably. Some staff members requested escorts to their cars after evening events. Others arranged to walk out in groups, timing their departure so no one lingered alone in the dark. Evening meetings were shortened. Theatre rehearsals moved to earlier hours. A few teachers even transferred districts, citing stress or family obligations, though privately admitting they no longer felt safe. It wasn't panic. Midwestern communities rarely succumbed to panic, but it was a quiet vigilance that permeated every hallway. The Pontiac appeared with greater frequency. Custodians reported seeing it circling lots before dawn, its headlights off, as if the driver preferred to navigate by memory. Students occasionally mentioned a strange car idling near back entrances after school, though when staff checked, it had always driven away. One district bus driver recalled the Pontiac keeping a steady distance behind him on an otherwise empty stretch of Route 136, maintaining the same speed for nearly 20 miles, before making a sudden slow turn onto a gravel road. He described the driver as still, almost rigid, but could not recall any distinct features. Around this time, the letters began arriving more regularly. Each one was sent to a different school, usually addressed either to the faculty or those who teach. They contained what looked like lesson fragments, objectives, behavioral notes, outlines, all written with a calm precision that made the pages feel more like academic exercises than communications from someone under investigation. Yet something in the tone unsettled readers. The sentences were clipped, almost severe, as if the writer were not outlining a subject but rather defining a system. A few letters referenced correction, discipline of the mind, and instruction continued in silence, phrases that sparked uneasy discussions among administrators. Investigators created a dedicated room to analyze the letters. Every sheet was pinned to corkboards, clustered by handwriting traits. Linguistic experts were called in to examine syntax and diction. The conclusion came back with a degree of confidence. The writer had some formal exposure to pedagogy. Not necessarily a teacher, but someone familiar with the structure of lesson planning, someone who understood the rhythm of instruction. This detail narrowed the psychological profile, but did little to identify a suspect. During the summer of 1982, a new piece of evidence emerged, small, almost negligible on its own, yet striking when placed within the context of the growing pattern. A middle school art teacher in Bloomington found a sheet of her own lesson notes missing from a drawer, replaced by a nearly identical version written in that same crisp handwriting. The outline mimicked her structure, but inserted strange directions such as observe before you respond and erase error without hesitation. There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance in the classroom. Investigators concluded the intruder must have entered during a narrow window after school hours, slipping in unnoticed through a side door frequently left unlocked during summer maintenance. That incident deepened the task force's suspicion that the perpetrator had an unusual level of access, either through familiarity with school layouts or through patient surveillance. They began mapping the architectural similarities between districts, noting repeated weak points, side exits near loading docks, basement doors used by maintenance staff, band room entrances hidden from street view. The Pontiac was seen near 2 such locations in the following months, always at a distance, always leaving before officers could approach. Throughout 1983 and 1984, the pattern seemed to slow. No new disappearances occurred, though teachers continued reporting small disturbances. Papers rearranged, classroom clocks reset to precise, identical times, chalkboards cleaned more thoroughly than they remembered leaving them. Investigators believed the perpetrator was still active, still present, but operating at a lower visibility. Some theorized he was selecting victims more carefully, studying routines more thoroughly. Others worried he was preparing for something more elaborate. Then, in March of 1985, another educator vanished. This time the victim was a widely respected literature teacher who had taught for nearly 2 decades. He was last seen leaving a district meeting shortly after sunset, carrying a stack of essays under his arm. His car was found the next morning near a disused grain elevator, its interior undisturbed except for a sheet of paper resting on the dashboard. The page contained a list of instructions written in the same deliberate hand. Brief, clipped phrases that resembled the earlier notes, but with an added element, a sense of codification, as if the writer were refining an internal system. The discovery reignited the case. Newspapers across Illinois published cautious summaries, though authorities urged restraint, avoiding explicit connections between incidents in different counties. Still, the public sensed the growing pattern. Community forums filled with speculation. Parents pressed administrators for updates. Some schools implemented ID checks at entrances for the first time, an uncommon measure in the era before large-scale security protocols. What troubled investigators most was the apparent mobility of the perpetrator. The counties involved spanned large distances, some separated by hours of highway driving. Yet surveillance sightings always mentioned the same Pontiac, the same deliberate driving behavior, the same quiet presence. Mechanics familiar with older models noted that the car's condition must have required consistent upkeep. The driver was either skilled with tools or had access to someone who was. The task force, now significantly larger, began coordinating with state-level agencies. They established an informal database. Binders sorted by victim profiles, vehicle sightings, letters, architectural weak points and timelines. Each binder grew thick with meticulously typed reports, maps and hand-drawn diagrams. Investigators spent long nights tracing routes between the last known locations of victims, looking for overlapping roads or rest stops. One route appeared repeatedly, a stretch of old highway running parallel to the Illinois River, dotted with small, seldom-used parking areas overlooking the water. Several vehicles belonging to victims had been discovered within a few miles of this corridor. The Pontiac had been sighted here at least 4 times. By 1986, a clearer behavioral pattern emerged. The perpetrator seemed drawn to educators with structured routines, those who stayed late to prepare lessons, graded papers in their cars, or maintained predictable schedules. He avoided schools with heavy foot traffic or well-lit lots. He preferred transitional spaces, semi-rural roads, old industrial lots, abandoned recreation areas. And always, there were the notes: tidy, instructional, ritualistic. Investigators consulted psychologists who specialized in behavioral analysis. Their assessment was unsettling but consistent. The perpetrator viewed teachers not just as individuals, but as symbols of authority, order, and instruction. His fixation was less personal than structural. He was reenacting a pattern rooted in correction, discipline, and control. The letters, always framed as lessons, suggested he believed himself to be demonstrating something, illustrating a point only he fully understood. They also noted a peculiar emotional absence in the writing. The notes lacked agitation, lacked impulsivity. They were cold, calm, methodical. This pointed to a perpetrator who planned extensively, someone capable of sustained focus and patience. The Pontiac's wandering routes were not random, but part of a larger surveillance pattern, one invisible without long-term mapping. In late 1987, a crucial witness came forward, a gas station attendant in a small town near the river. He recalled a man driving a brown Pontiac, who frequently purchased fuel during late-night hours. The man rarely spoke, paid in cash, and kept his gaze lowered. The attendant remembered him because of an unusual detail. The back seat of the car was always stacked with papers. Not newspapers, not magazines. Loose sheets organized into neat piles, almost like grading stacks. The attendant assumed the man was a teacher, commuting long distances, though he never saw him wearing anything resembling professional attire. Investigators built a composite description based on this and other scattered sightings, though none were detailed enough to produce an accurate portrait. Still, the witness account confirmed a long-held suspicion. The perpetrator transported written materials with him, perhaps drafts of letters, perhaps copied lesson plans. It emphasized his connection to structure, to education, to the ritual of writing. Through the late 1980s, the case became one of quiet endurance. Teachers adapted, communities remained cautious, and investigators kept tracing patterns. The Pontiac aged visibly during this period, yet it continued to appear, its color fading, its engine reportedly louder, its silhouette unmistakable. It had become a ghost car, recognized across regions, yet never stopped, never caught. As the decade closed, the pattern showed signs of intensifying again. Small districts reported new disturbances, classroom clocks synchronized to the same minute across separate campuses, faculty lockers rearranged with uncanny precision, anonymous notes resembling assessment rubrics appearing on desks. Investigators sensed the perpetrator's cycle accelerating, though they couldn't yet determine why. What they didn't know was that the man behind the wheel of the Pontiac had begun refining his routine for a final phase, one that would eventually lead investigators to the discovery they had been chasing for more than a decade. By the early months of 1989, the task force had accumulated enough fragments, maps, letters, witness accounts, sightings of the fading Pontiac, that patterns previously too subtle to notice began emerging in clearer form. The case no longer resembled a sequence of isolated disappearances. It had developed into a timeline, almost a syllabus of behavior, written in long stretches of highway, abandoned rest areas, and classroom routines. What troubled investigators was not just the repetition, but the refinement. Every new event seemed more deliberate than the last, as if the perpetrator were sharpening the edges of his own system. One of the detectives, a methodical officer named Raymond Carter, spent several evenings studying photo logs from the early cases. He noticed something no one else had highlighted. Many of the vehicles belonging to victims had been left facing east. It seemed trivial at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence since several of the pull-offs naturally faced that direction, but Carter saw it occur too consistently to ignore. He traced the orientation on a map and realized it placed the abandoned vehicles into a loose geographical arc that mirrored the first letter's postmarks. The arc followed a long north-to-south line along the Illinois River, touching small towns known mainly for quiet neighborhoods and aging school buildings. It was the kind of detail only someone deeply immersed in the case would detect. If Carter was right, the perpetrator was moving inside a controlled corridor, one that offered him proximity to multiple school districts while allowing easy disappearance into rural routes. Investigators began to suspect he might live somewhere within this corridor or maintain access to a place that served as a private workspace. Still, without a specific person to investigate, the theory remained another carefully pinned sheet on the task force wall. In 1990, a new incident signaled that the perpetrator was entering another active phase. A middle-aged math teacher in a rural district reported that her gradebook had been rearranged on her desk over a holiday weekend. She insisted she had left it closed, but returned to find the pages turned to a specific section and several lines underlined in neatly balanced strokes, lines discussing assessment, accuracy, and correction. She showed the alterations to her principal, who immediately contacted investigators. They compared the strokes to the handwriting in the letters and found enough similarity to consider it part of the same pattern. What disturbed them most was the implication. The perpetrator had entered the building during a break, navigated the dim hallways without leaving traces, and selected a classroom at random, or perhaps with intent. To do that, he needed knowledge of school schedules, building access points and blind spots where motion would go unnoticed. The incident reinforced a growing theory. He was comfortable inside educational settings, almost unnervingly so. Meanwhile, sightings of the Pontiac continued. Though the vehicle had aged significantly, its paint now dulled to a muddy brown, its left rear panel rusted, the silhouette remained unmistakable. Teachers traveling between districts reported seeing it on early morning roads, always maintaining a steady distance behind or ahead, never accelerating abruptly, never drawing attention. The car had become a moving symbol across the region, a reminder that the man behind the wheel still observed, still followed routines, still displayed a patience investigators had come to recognize as dangerous. During the fall of 1991, another letter arrived, this time at a small high school near Monmouth. Unlike previous notes, which resembled lesson fragments, this one carried a slightly different tone. It contained a sequence of numbered lines emphasizing repetition: repeat until mastered, correct until flawless, instruction requires silence, lesson must be learned. Though vague, the note suggested the perpetrator believed he was completing stages of some internal sequence. Investigators wondered whether he was approaching what he viewed as the final step. Psychologists who reviewed the letter returned an evaluation that narrowed the profile further. They noted that the writer's language had shifted subtly toward abstraction. Earlier letters had mirrored concrete classroom structures. This one resembled a distilled philosophy of teaching. The shift revealed a possible psychological transition. The perpetrator no longer viewed himself as observing teachers. He viewed himself as delivering a form of instruction. The implications unsettled everyone involved. The investigation intensified over the next 2 years. Detectives began interviewing former educators, school volunteers, substitute teachers, and staff who had worked across multiple districts during the late 1970s and early 1980s. They searched for anyone with unusual employment gaps, frequent relocations, or unexplained absences. Records from that era, however, were inconsistent. Many schools had kept paper files that had since been misplaced, purged or stored in basements prone to water damage. The task force achieved little progress, but the effort produced another unexpected detail. Several teachers from different districts mentioned seeing a quiet, solitary man attending open house nights or school plays in the late 1970s. None could recall his face in detail, but all remembered the same thing. He never spoke, rarely interacted, and often sat in corners where the lighting was weakest. Though these accounts were vague, they contributed to a growing understanding of the perpetrator's method of observation. He blended into crowds by remaining absolutely still. In 1993, the first major breakthrough occurred. A new postal clerk in a small town near Peoria discovered that several early letters had passed through the same regional sorting center. Though common for the area, he noticed 2 envelopes bore faint imprints from the same mechanical roller, suggesting they had been processed consecutively. Investigators cross-referenced all letters and confirmed 3 more shared the same printing flaw. It was the first physical connection, tying multiple letters together beyond handwriting. The flaw narrowed the geographic origin to one of several postal routes used during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The task force examined these routes closely. They traced them along old county highways, cataloging every property within miles of the mail paths. Many locations were family homes, small farms, or abandoned structures overtaken by weeds. But one property caught their attention, a former teacher's residence that had been vacant since 1981. The teacher who lived there had passed away suddenly that year, leaving the property unoccupied. Investigators inspected the house and found it empty, with no signs of unauthorized entry. Still, the location's proximity to several letter origins and to the river corridor made it noteworthy, though not conclusively tied to the case. Throughout 1994, investigators began analyzing behavioral timelines with greater precision. They noticed the perpetrator tended to escalate during late winter and early spring. Theories speculated that this timing corresponded to academic calendars, grading periods, midterms, performance evaluations. The connection reinforced the belief that his fixation was deeply rooted in the structure of educational life. It also suggested he may have once been a student or had prolonged contact with school systems during formative years. Then, a climatic shift occurred in early 1995. Teachers across 3 separate districts reported finding chalkboards wiped to a level of precision none of them recognized. These incidents occurred on nights when buildings were locked. Investigators tested access logs, such as they existed in that era, and determined no janitorial staff had been assigned those rooms. The pattern echoed earlier disturbances, but appeared more uniform, more synchronized. It was as if the perpetrator were marking multiple campuses simultaneously, demonstrating reach rather than subtlety. Around this same period, the Pontiac reappeared in force. In March alone, it was sighted near 6 different school lots across a 50-mile radius. Witness accounts described the driver as motionless behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel at the same angle, his posture unwavering. One coach reported following the car for several minutes after a late practice, only to watch it turn abruptly onto a narrow rural road that led nowhere except an old service trail. When deputies searched the area later, they found no trace of the vehicle. Investigators now believed they were approaching a breaking point, not because they were close to identifying the man, but because his behaviors suggested an impending shift. The letters, the chalkboards, the synchronized incidents, they all indicated that he was tightening his pattern, refining it with a purpose the task force had yet to decipher. In late 1995, a retired school secretary provided a testimony that altered the trajectory of the investigation. She remembered a man from the late 1970s who had frequently entered her school under the pretense of requesting old curriculum materials. He carried himself quietly, politely, but she recalled an odd detail. He always declined to sign the visitor log. At the time, she assumed he was shy or uncomfortable with bureaucratic procedures. Now, in light of the case, she admitted the memory had taken on unsettling weight. She described his clothing, plain, slightly oversized jackets, muted colors, and his manner of holding materials, always with 2 hands, as if aligning edges mattered. When investigators showed her samples of the handwriting from the letters, she paused for nearly 20 seconds before saying she couldn't be certain, but something about the pen pressure looked familiar. It was the first time in nearly 2 decades that someone had potentially interacted directly with the man behind the Pontiac. By 1996, the task force had grown cautious of assuming they understood the perpetrator's intentions. He had shown adaptability, patience, and intelligence that defied easy classification, but what none of them yet realized was that the investigation was slowly converging on a single geographical point. The clues, scattered across years, were beginning to connect, not through dramatic revelations, but through the quiet accumulation of small, consistent details. And the man in the Pontiac, still circling school lots with the same unhurried calm he had maintained since the late 1970s, had already sensed the shift. He had begun preparing for the moment when observation would no longer suffice, when instruction, as he perceived it, required demonstration, and demonstration required closure. By early 1996, investigators sensed a shift in the case's inertia. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of breakthrough that television would one day romanticize, but rather a subtle tightening of threads that had once seemed too loose to matter. The Pontiac had resurfaced with greater frequency, the letters had grown more abstract, and the disturbances inside schools were becoming more synchronized, appearing across districts on nearly identical dates. It was as if the perpetrator had begun operating on a schedule only he fully understood. One development during this period marked the beginning of a more focused investigation. A young deputy assigned to review archived letters noticed something odd about the paper stock used in the most recent notes. While older letters were typed or handwritten on standard-line sheets, the new ones were written on slightly heavier paper with a faint watermark, something only visible when held to fluorescent light. The watermark indicated a manufacturer that sold primarily to academic institutions during the late 1980s. The discovery was faint, almost invisible, but it was the first material clue tying the perpetrator to a specific type of educational supply. Investigators conducted discreet checks with regional school districts to determine which institutions had ordered that brand of paper. The results were inconclusive. Multiple schools within the river corridor had purchased it in bulk. Yet the detail contributed to a growing impression that the perpetrator remained connected in some way to the world of academic materials. Perhaps he had worked in supply management. Perhaps he had been employed in a district facility. Perhaps he had found employment in a setting that maintained ties to education without involving direct teaching. Meanwhile, small but recurring reports continued filtering in. Teachers found their desk drawers rearranged, not chaotically but thoughtfully, as if someone had examined the contents, then restored them with careful alignment. In one district, a staff member discovered a series of perfectly parallel pencil marks drawn inside a storage cabinet she hadn't opened in weeks. The janitorial crew denied involvement. Investigators recognized the marks as a form of measuring, perhaps spacing, perhaps something more symbolic. When they compared the spacing to the line lengths in the most recent letter, the proportions matched almost exactly. The perpetrator was no longer merely observing, he was calibrating. In the spring of that year, a school bus mechanic from a small town near the river corridor provided an unexpected tip. He reported that for several months, someone had been entering the old, unused bus depot behind the district garage. The locks were never broken, but tools were moved subtly, rags rearranged, tire chalk marks appearing in places no one on staff had left them. The mechanic assumed it was a former employee with a spare key. But one detail caught investigators' attention. The intruder had consistently adjusted the side mirrors on the oldest retired buses, the ones no longer in service. The adjustments were precise, symmetrical, as if someone had been aligning them to reflect specific angles. Investigators visited the depot. They found no fingerprints, no footprints, no definitive evidence, but one of the retired buses bore faint scratches on the steering wheel, marks consistent with someone gripping it for long periods while the vehicle remained stationary. This discovery reinforced a suspicion that had grown quietly among several detectives. The perpetrator practiced routines inside vehicles when no one was watching, rehearsing routes, planning timing, studying angles of approach and departure. The Pontiac, then, was not his only point of reference. It was merely the one the public occasionally glimpsed. During this same period, another witness emerged. An aging school board member who recalled a man from the late 1970s who frequently attended board meetings without speaking. He never signed in, never requested documents, but always sat in the same place, along the back wall, near a shadowed corner where the overhead lights dimmed to a soft yellow. The board member remembered him because, after the meetings, the man often lingered in the hallway as if studying the bulletin boards. She dismissed it at the time as unusual but harmless behavior. Now, in light of the case, she described an unsettling detail. He always carried a notepad, though she never saw him write. Investigators cross-referenced her description with old meeting minutes and visitor logs, though records from that era were incomplete. Still, the detail of the notepad echoed an observation from the gas station attendant years earlier. The man in the Pontiac keeping stacks of paper in the back seat. These small consistencies gave the task force a sense that they were closing in, though not yet in a way that allowed for immediate action. Throughout late 1996, the letters grew more frequent, though shorter. Some contained only a single line: "Correction requires observation." Another read, "Instruction continues." A third, sent to a district office near Jacksonville, contained only one word: "Review." Investigators interpreted these notes not as taunts, but as indicators of the perpetrator's internal progression. He appeared to view himself as completing stages of a self-imposed curriculum, advancing through steps the way a student moves through chapters. One of the most significant developments came from mapping specialists brought in to analyze the Pontiac's sightings. They organized the reports chronologically, plotting each location onto a layered map that covered nearly 2 decades. The result amazed the task force. The sightings formed a looping route that repeated roughly every 3 to 5 years, though with slight variations. It was as if the perpetrator were following a circuit, revisiting sites like a teacher, refining a lesson plan. The pattern's symmetry confirmed that the Pontiac's movements were not random, they were rehearsed. Investigators theorized the route had a central anchor point, a location the perpetrator returned to regularly. The problem was determining where that point lay. The route included dozens of potential candidates: abandoned warehouses, isolated farms, closed schools, unused maintenance buildings. But one location stood out for its consistency: an old teacher training center that had closed in 1980. The center sat halfway between several major incidents and directly along the looping route. Its last records indicated it had once stored teaching materials, including thousands of unused lesson templates. The task force visited the site. The building, though locked, showed signs of occasional entry. Dust disturbed near door frames, faint shoe impressions on the wooden floor, and the smell of old paper stronger than expected for a structure left untouched for more than a decade. Inside, unused resources still lined shelves: binders of curriculum guides, grading rubrics, and lesson outlines printed in formats strikingly similar to the structure of the letters investigators had received. Although the building yielded no definitive evidence connecting the perpetrator to the site, its atmosphere and materials matched several elements of the behavioral profile. In early 1997, tensions escalated. Several teachers across different districts reported seeing the Pontiac idling near school lots, not only in the evening but in the early morning as well. The driver never stepped out, never interacted, but always kept the vehicle positioned in a way that allowed a clear view of side entrances. The sightings occurred too frequently to be coincidence, yet the car vanished each time deputies arrived. The task force recognized that the perpetrator seemed to be entering a more active phase. The letters reinforced this. One note delivered in February read, "The final lesson requires completion." Another, "All instruction must end." Investigators debated the meaning of these messages. Some believed the perpetrator was preparing to escalate. Others suspected he was approaching a psychological or ritualistic conclusion. Behavioral analysts warned that, based on the tone and phrasing, the perpetrator might perceive himself as nearing the culmination of a long-standing process, one that spanned nearly 2 decades. In late 1997, a breakthrough finally emerged from an unexpected direction. A retired teacher who had worked in multiple districts during the late 1970s contacted investigators after reading about new developments in a regional newspaper. She recalled an incident from 1978 involving a man who had repeatedly asked her for copies of lesson plans she had discarded. She described him as quiet, polite, but oddly insistent on receiving pages she considered mundane. When shown samples of the handwriting from the letters, she hesitated, then nodded, stating that while she couldn't be certain, the writing style looked too similar to ignore. Investigators checked employment records for substitutes, volunteers, and temporary staff across several districts during that period. Their search produced one name that appeared more than once: a former education student who had worked briefly as a classroom helper in the late 1970s before leaving the program abruptly without explanation. His file was thin, but one detail stood out. He had grown up within the river corridor and lived in close proximity to the old teacher training center investigators had recently visited. When officers attempted to locate him, they discovered the man had no recent employment records, no local address, and no known phone listing. It was as if he had carefully erased his presence from public view. But they found one detail they had not expected. The man, years earlier, had once owned a mid-1970s brown Pontiac registered in his name. The registration had expired long ago, yet the car, unchanged, still moved through the region's shadows. And as investigators processed this discovery, the Pontiac appeared again, this time not on a rural road or behind a school, but near a location that shifted the entire case. It was seen parked near the edge of the Illinois River, facing east, engine off, driver's seat slightly reclined, waiting, as if the perpetrator sensed that the investigation had finally begun to converge on him and had decided the next move would be his. By early 1998, the Pontiac's reappearance along the Illinois River signaled to investigators that the case was entering its final phase. It wasn't intuition, it was pattern recognition. The perpetrator had behaved cyclically for nearly 2 decades, and his movements now suggested a deliberate return to earlier locations, almost as if he were revisiting chapters in a long, silent curriculum he had designed for himself. The car's position, facing east, with the driver's seat slightly reclined, echoed the earliest incidents. Everything pointed toward repetition, not of behavior, but of ritual. Investigators intensified surveillance along the river corridor, focusing on old service roads, abandoned lookouts, and isolated rest areas where the Pontiac had been sighted over the years. Deputy teams rotated through 24-hour shifts, relying on unmarked vehicles and radios tuned to discrete frequencies. Yet the perpetrator had always demonstrated a remarkable ability to evade detection. His movements were slow, patient, measured. He never approached a location unless the lighting, traffic, and visibility were exactly right. It was as if he rehearsed each approach mentally before executing it. One night in February, a deputy stationed near a bend in the river reported seeing the Pontiac parked beneath a row of cottonwoods. The headlights were off, but the engine idled softly. As the deputy approached, the vehicle slipped away in a smooth arc, disappearing into the tree line before backup could arrive. Tire impressions were later found in the dirt, shallow and uniform, the same pattern seen in earlier sightings. Though frustrating, the encounter confirmed something critical. The perpetrator was still following his established routes, still tethered to the same behaviors. Around this time, forensic analysts revisited the letters, searching for overlooked clues. One specialist noticed that the spacing between lines in the most recent notes aligned almost perfectly with standard margins used in lesson planning templates distributed by teacher training centers in the late 1970s. This connected the letters to the abandoned training facility investigators had explored months earlier. Although the building hadn't yielded physical evidence, the linguistic alignment reinforced the belief that the perpetrator had once spent time there, perhaps during his attempts to enter the teaching profession. Investigators began revisiting old faculty rosters, focusing on individuals who had enrolled in education programs during the late 1970s but never completed their certifications. Among them was the man tied to the Pontiac registration decades earlier. His academic file revealed that he had withdrawn from a teacher training program abruptly, with no explanation recorded. His instructors had described him as quiet, observant, and unusually fixated on lesson structure. One noted that he tended to rewrite assignments repeatedly, seeking perfect alignment even when unnecessary. This portrayal matched the behavioral profile with disturbing precision. The task force now suspected that the man saw himself not as a participant in the educational system, but as someone outside it, someone who believed he could perfect its structure from a distance. His fixation on teachers wasn't personal, it was symbolic. They represented order, authority, correction, and to him the act of writing, lesson plans, outlines, instructions, appeared more significant than any interpersonal connection. As investigators reconstructed his past, they discovered another detail. During his short time in the program, he had frequently volunteered to assist at after-school events, though he rarely interacted with students. Instead, he stood along walls, notepad in hand, observing classrooms and bulletin boards. One former instructor recalled that he often asked unusual questions about classroom routines, how teachers structured transitions, how they organized materials, how they managed silence between activities. At the time, the instructor dismissed his questions as intense curiosity. Now she viewed them differently. Meanwhile, the Pontiac sightings grew more concentrated. Rather than drifting across multiple districts, the vehicle appeared repeatedly near a cluster of 3 towns along the river, towns closely tied to the suspect's past. The task force suspected he had either returned to an old residence or found a new location nearby where he could observe schools from a distance without drawing attention. They began discreet surveillance operations, placing unmarked cars near staff lots and old training buildings. Then, in late March, a breakthrough emerged, not dramatic but decisive. A school office manager in one of the river towns reported that someone had quietly slipped a sheet of paper into the faculty mail sorter during the night. The note contained a sequence of lines written in the same unmistakable handwriting. Review, correct, final instruction approaching. The format matched earlier letters, but the message carried a tone of imminent conclusion. Investigators retrieved the note and examined the paper stock. The watermark was identical to the one identified in newer letters, confirming it came from the same source. They cross-checked building access and discovered that the back door of the school, rarely used except by maintenance workers, had been opened sometime around 3 a.m. The door had not been forced. Someone had used a key. This detail narrowed the investigation further. Only a small number of people had access to that key: district custodial staff, maintenance workers, and a single substitute employee who had worked irregular shifts during the winter. When investigators looked into the substitute's file, they discovered another unsettling detail. He had provided no current address, listing only a post office box in a nearby town, and the man's full legal name matched the former education student tied to the Pontiac. Within days, the task force secured a warrant for his employment records, bank history, and identification documents. But the trail revealed almost nothing. He had no active bank account, no tax filings for several years, and no vehicle registered in his name. It was as if he had deliberately erased every administrative trace, leaving only the faint shadow of an old Pontiac registration from the late 1970s. Investigators expanded surveillance across the river towns, focusing on old barns, unused maintenance buildings, and rental properties that allowed tenants to pay in cash. One abandoned property, a former supply shed behind a vocational center, showed signs of recent careful entry. Dust on the floor had been disturbed in straight, narrow patterns, as if someone had dragged small boxes or stacks of paper. On the far wall, police found faint impressions where stacks had been placed repeatedly over time. They matched the dimensions of the loose papers seen in the back seat of the Pontiac years earlier. The task force now believed they had located a place the perpetrator used as a staging point, a place where he sorted materials, revised notes, and rehearsed routines. But there was no sign of him, only order, symmetry, precision. The discovery triggered a full statewide alert. Patrol units were instructed to watch for the Pontiac, even if partially restored or modified. Officers were briefed not to initiate traffic stops alone. The suspect had demonstrated extraordinary patience and situational awareness. They needed to catch him in a controlled environment, not on an open stretch of highway where he could vanish again. In April, the turning point finally arrived. A school custodian in a small lakeside town reported seeing the Pontiac parked at the far edge of the staff lot shortly before sunrise. The driver remained inside, motionless, watching the building. The custodian, aware of the investigation, phoned local authorities. This time, the response was immediate. Deputies converged from multiple directions, aiming to block all exits. When they arrived, the Pontiac was still there. The engine was off. The driver sat upright, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, someone saw his face clearly. He didn't try to flee, he didn't try to speak. He simply stared forward, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, as if waiting for the next step in a sequence he had long rehearsed. When officers approached, he lifted his gaze just slightly, studying their formation with the same evaluative, calm investigators had attributed to him all these years. As he was removed from the vehicle, he offered no resistance and uttered only one quiet sentence, spoken not to any officer, but to himself. Lesson completed. It was the first and last time he ever acknowledged his own pattern aloud. When the man was brought into custody in April of 1998, investigators expected volatility, resistance, or at least the confusion most suspects displayed when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Instead, he remained almost unnervingly calm, maintaining a posture that suggested he had anticipated this moment with the same methodical patience that had defined his movements for nearly 20 years. He sat at the interview table with his hands neatly folded, looking neither frightened nor defiant, but rather contemplative, as if reflecting on a long-completed assignment. The first interview lasted nearly 3 hours. Detectives presented him with letters, maps, timelines, and photographs of the Pontiac from various sightings over the decades. He responded to none of it. He neither confirmed nor denied involvement. He simply listened, his expression fixed, his eyes occasionally following the alignment of papers on the table, as if studying their arrangement rather than their content. When detectives asked direct questions, he remained silent. When they attempted to provoke emotional response, he stared past them, focusing on the one-way glass as if expecting someone else to emerge from behind it. Eventually, an investigator placed a single sheet of paper in front of him, a copy of the earliest letter investigators had received in the late 1970s. The man's eyes lingered on the page, tracing the familiar handwriting with a slow, deliberate gaze. After several seconds, he spoke softly, almost as if reciting something from memory. Instruction requires order. It was not a confession, nor an explanation, but it marked the first verbal acknowledgement tying him to the behavioral structure that had defined the case. Subsequent interviews followed a similar pattern. Detectives found that he would not respond to direct accusations, but reacted subtly to anything referencing structure, repetition, or correction. A behavioral specialist observing from behind the glass noted that these reactions indicated not guilt in the traditional sense, but alignment, an internal recognition of the conceptual framework that had driven his actions for decades. He seemed less interested in defending himself than in assessing whether investigators understood what he considered the sequence. When pressed for details, he never responded with concrete information. Instead, he made occasional remarks that resembled fragments of lesson outlines. You begin with observation, correction follows misalignment, completion requires silence. Each sentence echoed the phrasing of the letters scattered across the case file. It became evident to investigators that he was not offering confession, but rather continuing a pattern, as though the interviews were simply another stage in a process he believed had to be completed. Meanwhile, forensic teams searched his residence, an isolated, sparsely furnished structure at the edge of one of the river towns. Inside, they found no incriminating items, no written confessions, no trophies or personal artifacts. Instead, the rooms contained stacks of blank paper arranged in symmetrical columns, several sharpened pencils lined with precise spacing, and notebooks filled only with repeated outlines of days, dates, and empty lesson templates. The house reflected a meticulously controlled inner world, sterile, quiet, and devoid of anything resembling a personal life. The most revealing space was a small room near the back of the house. Its walls were lined with old classroom posters, attendance charts, and rubrics collected from various districts over the years. None were defaced or annotated. They had been preserved as if part of an archive, arranged with mathematical order. Investigators noted that several posters matched those reported missing from schools throughout the 1980s and 1990s. This room became the clearest illustration of his fixation. A curated environment intended not for teaching, but for studying the structure of teaching itself. Forensic comparisons of handwriting samples confirmed beyond doubt that he had written every letter investigators had collected since the first disappearance. The pressure points matched, the slant matched, the spacing matched. Even the watermarked paper found in his home matched the newer letters exactly. His movements over the years aligned perfectly with the Pontiac's mapped routes, and witnesses who had interacted with him decades earlier confirmed the accuracy of his physical description. Although he never confessed directly, the accumulation of evidence formed an unbroken chain. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court portrayed him as someone who had constructed an internal system around authority, order, and correction. He did not process human relationships in conventional ways. Instead, he interpreted behaviors, environments, and routines as components of a broader instructional pattern. Teachers to him represented the clearest embodiment of structure. And writing, the act of creating lessons, outlines, and rubrics, had become both a ritual and a form of self-expression. Despite his silence on specific acts, investigators managed to link him to each incident through circumstantial evidence, timelines, vehicle sightings, and physical handwriting connections. The Pontiac, though aged and in poor condition, held residues of old paper fibers matching those found in his home. In multiple abandoned locations, dust samples matched the particular composition of material stored in the training center he once frequented. Even soil patterns from the undercarriage of the Pontiac corresponded to several secluded sites connected to the investigation. The trial began in late 1998. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, though proceedings were conducted without sensationalism in keeping with the ethical guidelines authorities insisted on. Prosecutors presented 2 decades of methodical work: letters, interviews, behavioral patterns, and maps illustrating the looping route the Pontiac had followed across the river corridor. They emphasized not spectacle, but structure, the same structure the perpetrator himself had imposed upon his actions. The defense attempted to argue lack of direct confession, but the volume of converging evidence rendered the point moot. Psychological experts testified about his fixation on educational frameworks, explaining how his patterns reflected a distorted form of instructional philosophy. Witnesses described seeing him at school events, staff lots, and rural pull-offs. Forensic specialists demonstrated the handwriting matches with scientific precision. Throughout the trial, the man sat immobile, hands folded, gaze fixed forward. He rarely looked at the evidence, the witnesses, or the judge. He responded only once during the entire proceeding, when the prosecutor referenced the earliest letter and described it as the beginning of a pattern of control. The man lifted his head slightly and whispered, barely audibly, "Not control, completion." It was the only substantive statement he made in court. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. Given the era and jurisdiction, the prosecution had the option to pursue the death penalty. However, they chose instead to seek life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Citing the nature of the case, the absence of graphic violence in public evidence, and the psychological framework presented at trial, the judge agreed, sentencing him to multiple consecutive life terms in a maximum security facility. During his transfer, he remained as calm as he had been during his arrest, walking with steady steps, his expression unchanged. When officers secured him in the transport vehicle, he leaned back slightly, hands resting on his lap, as if settling into the next stage of a process he had long anticipated. For the first time, he did not speak. He did not whisper. He simply remained still. In the years that followed, his name faded from public conversation, becoming one more case file referenced only in training programs and investigative seminars. Yet the impact of his long pattern lingered. Schools across the region adopted new security measures: locks, lighting protocols, staff check-ins, policies for after-hours access. Districts that had once left doors open now implemented structured verification systems. For many, the case served as a reminder that structures taken for granted could become vulnerabilities when observed by someone who understood them too well. Investigators who had worked the case for years reflected on the magnitude of patience it required, not just from the suspect, but from those pursuing him. They remembered the long nights of sorting maps, matching handwriting, studying behavior. Several admitted that the quiet roads along the river corridor felt different after the arrest, not because danger had vanished, but because the silence no longer carried the weight of something unseen. In the end, the case became less about the man behind the Pontiac and more about the fragile balance between order and observation. He had constructed a private world in which teaching was not instruction, but structure, not communication, but ritual. And through that lens, he had acted with a precision that forced investigators to confront patterns they might otherwise have overlooked. Years later, one of the lead detectives summarized the case in a simple sentence: he was never chasing them, he was studying them. That reflection echoed through the task force long after the trial ended. It underscored a truth often forgotten in criminal investigation, that the quietest patterns, the ones built on small repetitions and subtle behaviors, are the ones that demand the most attention. And in the quiet of a prison cell, far from the river roads and school parking lots he once navigated, the man who had spent 2 decades building a private curriculum of observation sat alone, no longer in motion, no longer preparing lessons, no longer waiting for the next step. His sequence had ended.